Good morning, U.S. history students. Today we are going to be covering Notes 5.1, the 1950s. Your essential question: how did life change for Americans post World War II? So, just a quick review of World War II, post World War II. So, remember, World War II ended in 1945. Winston Churchill, who was the leader of England at the time, he gave his speech called the Iron Curtain speech, came to be known as the Iron Curtain speech, and this said that we were going to divide Europe. Western Europe was going to be democratic countries, Eastern Europe is going to be communist countries. President Truman of the United States gave a speech called the Truman Doctrine in 1947, in which he said the US will help countries around the world resist communism. This was a policy called containment. So, in order to help contain communism, we were offering aid to any country that refused to be a communist country. So, we called this the Marshall Plan in 1947. It was US aid to help out countries in Western Europe. This map up here shows you the amounts of money in millions that we were giving to all of these countries. So, you can see the majority of the money did go to France and the United Kingdom, our closest allies. And this was pretty much the division of Europe after World War II was over, so during the Cold War, into West and East. NATO became the organization of the democratic countries, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And in response to this, the Warsaw Pact was created in 1955. This was the organization of all the Soviet countries that were going to be communist nations. So the Marshall Plan ended up giving over $13 billion in a 4-year period to European countries to avoid communism and help rebuild their nations after World War II. There was a worry that democracy could not survive in these nations that were struggling to rebuild and that many people might be drawn to communism. So the Marshall Plan was really to push people towards democracy. After World War II was over, Germany was divided into four different sectors. The United States, England, France, and the Soviet Union were all going to get a slice of Germany. Berlin was also going to be divided in the same way. The Western countries decided to unify their three zones and give independence to that nation, and that would become known as West Germany until 1989. This country over here would be East Germany, so Germany would be divided from 1945 until 1989 into two separate nations. Berlin also is the capital city, but as you see, Berlin was also split between West and East. So a tiny bit of East Germany actually belonged to West Germany, that little yellow dot on the map there. Hundreds of thousands of Eastern Europeans were actually fleeing communism through the city of Berlin. And it was very embarrassing to the Soviets. They were not happy about this at all. So Stalin decided he was going to shut off West Berlin from all outside help. So he was going to build a wall around West Berlin, and that way he would cut them off by road, by water, by train. This separation would last until 1989. In order to support those people who were West Germans in East Berlin, West Germans and East Germany that were in the western section of Berlin. President Truman decided that we didn't want to risk going into war with the Soviet Union, but we still wanted to help out these people who were trapped by the Berlin Wall. So during the next 11 months or so, the British and American airplanes would fly over the city of West Berlin and they would drop off food, fuel, and other supplies to the citizens of West Berlin. This became known as the Berlin Airlift. And this is what that wall looked like. So in 1961, they built that Berlin Wall. Stalin built it around the western part of Berlin. It was 96 miles, kind of set up like a prison. They had watchtowers, they had armed guards inside. They were thick brick walls. They had barbed wire on top. So the Cold War is going to be between the Soviet Union and the United States. It never actually reached an actual war between these two nations. They weren't fighting directly against each other, which is why it's known as a Cold War instead of a hot war. It never actually heated up. Some say that the Cold War never actually stopped, or it's starting up again because we are having so many conflicts with Russia to this day. So the two world superpowers are the United States and the Soviet Union, but the main conflict of the war would be this atomic warfare. So the United States and the Soviet Union having access to atomic weapons. Stalin wanted to help these countries in Eastern Europe become part of the Warsaw Pact because he wanted them to be a buffer against future attacks of the Soviet Union, and he also wanted to use their resources to help rebuild Russia. The United States continued to create nuclear weapons after we used two to end World War II. The Bikini Islands in the Pacific were used as a nuclear weapon testing ground from 1946 to 1958. We removed the people who lived there, used their islands as a weapon testing ground, and then after we were done, we let them move back in, even though we didn't really know the full extent of the radiation and effects on the soil and the land that these people would be moving back into. So the main conflict of the Soviet or of the Cold War would be this idea of MAD, mutually assured destruction. So we had nuclear warfare and the Soviet Union had nuclear warfare, and we knew that if either one of us used these, we would both end up using them. So if the Soviet Union used one of these bombs on us, we would use one on them, and we would both be mutually assured that our countries would be destroyed. So these two superpowers would never actually fight directly, but they would fight in what we would call proxy wars. So they would go into different nations around the world when they were having conflict, and the United States and the Soviet Union would support two different sides of that. Meanwhile, in the United States, 1948, President Truman issued Executive Order 9981, which ended segregation in the U.S. Armed Forces. So remember, in World War II, we had all of those different segregated units based on race. Well, that ended right after World War II in 1948. So we started having integration of all of the different military branches. As we learned about yesterday in the podcast, the GI Bill was passed in 1944, and this was to help veterans transition back into civilian life. So, the GI Bill provided money for veterans to attend college, to buy homes, buy farms, buy businesses, help them find work, and offered them up to a year's worth of unemployment benefits. Now, remember, this was offered very easily to white veterans, but not so easily to African American veterans and other veterans of color who were trying to receive the same benefits that they had earned by fighting the war. All right, moving into the 1950s in America. So, in the 1950s, we had something called the baby boom. So, on average, we had one baby born every 7 seconds in 1957. This was after the war had ended. All of these soldiers are coming back, and we have a massive increase in the birth rate in the United States. By 1960, a third of the US population lived in the suburbs. So, again, as we learned about in the podcast, lots of people started moving into these kind of cookie cutter houses that all looked the same. These were known as Levitt towns. This was the idea of the American dream, living in a house with a white picket fence, a wife at home working, a wife at home and the husband working, and two kids and a dog. But remember, these Levitt towns were segregated. They were for white families only. They were not for families of color. And there was television that came out in the 1950s. TVs became very popular. Most people started purchasing them to have them in their homes, and so these typical TV shows in the 50s started glorifying this suburban lifestyle, very heteronormative, patriarchy families. We have the father who works, and then the mother who takes care of the children. In 1956, we have the Interstate Highway Act. It's the largest public works project in American history. We built the interstate highways that would go all across the nation, as you can see here in this map. These red lines are all the different interstate roads that were created in 1956. In 1955, here in California, we had Disneyland opened in Southern California. So 40% of the guests who came from outside of California, and they came by car. They drove here by car to experience this new land. TV was very big in entertainment during the 50s. TV celebrated traditional American values. Westerns were very popular. And we had teen culture in the 1950s. So in the 1950s, we actually had the word teenager entered into the American language. We started using that word to describe people your age, teenagers. Teenagers started listening to rock and roll music. They started watching movies like Rebel Without a Cause that showed or glorified juvenile delinquency. And at the same time, older generations were experiencing a religious revival. So people were using their televisions to watch preachers on TV. And we had very strictly defined gender roles in the 1950s. So the ideal modern woman was married, she cooked, she cared for her family, she entertained guests, she kept her family's suburban house, and she worked out. The ideal 1950s man was the provider, the protector, and the boss of the house. So, very strict gender roles in the 1950s. But not everybody thought this way in the 1950s. We also had psychologists actually examining this sort of behavior. So, Alfred Kinsey would become one of the most famous psychologists out of this time, and he studied the changing sexual behavior of adults in the United States. So, he would use this scale, which would become known as the Kinsey scale of sexuality. And he said that most people fall somewhere along this scale. A zero on the scale is exclusively heterosexual, and a six on the scale is exclusively homosexual or LGBTQ. And he said that most people fall somewhere along this scale. In 1957, the Russians beat us to space. They actually launched Sputnik, which would beat the United States in the space race. They were the first ones to get a satellite launched into space that would circle around the globe. So the United States responded in 1958 by passing the National Defense Education Act, which provided more money for science and math education. We were really scared by the Russians being able to send a missile up into space. That means they had progressed beyond us. So in 1958, we created NASA, the National Space and Aeronautics Agency. We were very afraid as a nation of nuclear warfare, and so many people started building bomb shelters within their own homes. They started stacking them up with food, water, books, magazines, just in case of an emergency. And then the Soviet Union and the United States started competing in what became known as the space race from 1957 all the way up until 1975. So they had parallel efforts between these two nations to explore space with artificial satellites, send humans into space, and land people on the moon. So Sputnik was the first satellite ever to be sent up into orbit, so they did beat us to space, but we also beat them to the moon. Kids at this time started developing sort of anxiety when they were at school around atomic warfare. So, as you all unfortunately have to go through fire drills at school, you go through earthquake drills at school, you also go through active shooter drills because active shooters are a danger for you now in the world that we're living in. In the 1950s, they didn't have active shooter drills, but they had atomic warfare drills. So the students would have to learn how to duck and cover under their desks to protect themselves from an atomic bomb. Okay. This wasn't from an atomic bomb actually like hitting them. Obviously, we know that would kind of wipe them out, but this was if an atomic bomb dropped somewhere relatively nearby, which would shake and damage their building to protect them from the aftermath. Because of this new space race, UFO sightings started skyrocketing in the United States during the 1950s, and we started having movies that portrayed aliens coming to the United States. And we use aliens as a metaphor for communists. So, of course, we would have another Red Scare in the United States. This was the second Red Scare. Remember, the first one happened in the early 1900s in the United States. Our second Red Scare, again, a Red Scare is a fear of communism, so a fear that communism would spread or take over the world. In 1949, the Russians were able to build their own nuclear bomb. 1950, we have the conflict in Korea. Communist North Korea tries to defeat South Korea and the United States, and North Korea receives military and financial aid from the Soviet Union and China, which were both communist countries. So, during the Great Depression in the United States, actually, millions of Americans joined the Communist Party. They decided they wanted to be communists. Communists treated everyone in society equally, and during the Great Depression, a lot of people needed something like that. Most communists would eventually quit their support of the party, but eventually their past would come back to haunt them when we started having this Red Scare. President Truman established some loyalty programs in 1947 where he would require all people who were applying for jobs in the United States to swear their loyalty to the United States. And we had the House Un American Activities Committee, the HUAC, that investigated communist infiltration of government agencies and the Hollywood movie industry. Hollywood writers and directors were called to Congress to go testify. They asked them, have they ever or are you now or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? We had 10 people from Hollywood, the Hollywood 10, who refused to answer any of the questions, invoking their constitutional right, their Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. They had to serve jail terms for 6 months to a year, and then movie studios started compiling a blacklist, and they said these people should not be hired because they are communist. In Texas, you could go to jail up to 20 years for being a communist. In New York, citizens had to pledge their loyalty to get a fishing license. In Indiana, professional wrestlers had to have a loyalty oath. And right here in California, we also have a loyalty oath. So, this is a loyalty pledge adopted by California in 1952 to root out communists. This is something that we still use today. So, this right here is from our district right here in West Sacramento. We have to sign this. All the teachers have to sign this that we will swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of California. So, we have to swear and sign this to be able to teach right here in West Sacramento. So the second Red Scare was really led by this Senator Joseph McCarthy, so it became known as McCarthyism. But eventually, he charged members of the army of being communist sympathizers, and then Americans started to turn against him. So famous broadcasters of the time started publicly challenging him and his accusations. And now the word McCarthyism has come to mean unfair or untrue accusations to make a person look bad. So the Korean War, as we read about yesterday, would last for just 3 years, from 1950 to 1953, but technically it's still going on today because we never actually signed a peace agreement. So Korea is divided on the 38th parallel between North and South Korea. So towards the end of World War II, it was agreed that the Soviets would occupy the north half of Korea and the US would occupy the southern half of the Korea. The division was here at this latitude line, the 38th parallel. And the Soviets, of course, set up a communist nation in the north, and the US would set up a capitalist system in the south. So North Korea's goal was to unite Korea by force. They had their leadership from the Soviet Union, and they would go on July 25th, 1950, and they would cross that 38th parallel down into South Korea. They were able to push back and capture the capital just 3 days later of South Korea. By July 5th, they were pushing back even further. We had the first battle between American and North Korean troops. General Walker gave the stand or die order. Okay, so after that, the United States started pushing back. We started pushing back up into North Korea. And then the Chinese army started secretly slipping into North Korea and helping out the North Koreans. The Chinese were able to push North Korea and South Korea back down, and we ended the war exactly where we started. So President Truman did end up firing MacArthur. President Truman fired MacArthur because MacArthur was critical of President Truman and not letting him use atomic warfare, atomic bombs on North Korea. So as you can see, the first step and the sixth step look exactly the same. So we started at the 38th parallel and we ended at the 38th parallel. It was 3 years of warfare that ended up right back where they started. So the end of the fighting occurred in 1953. The US lost more than 30,000 soldiers to end up right where we started. But an official peace treaty was never signed between North and South Korea. Still today, we have over 30,000 US troops stationed in North Korea. So as you can see, the beginning of the war and the end of the war. And this is the division of North and South Korea still to this day. So President Eisenhower would be our president from 1953 until 1961. President Eisenhower, remember, served in the military during World War II. And his goal was to have a global disarmament. So he wanted to lower the amount of nuclear weapons that we had all across the world. This would become known as arms control. He also wanted us to build up a world community, so he thought that we should fund more into the United Nations, we should get countries to participate and support each other more throughout the United Nations. He said that the United States and the Soviet Union must negotiate for peace. Atomic power should only be used for peaceful purposes. So the Soviet Union met with the United States along with England and France in 1955 in the city of Geneva. This would become known as the Geneva Conference. This eventually led to a peace treaty in 1955, resulting in the end of the joint occupation of Austria. So they gave Austria back their independence in 1955 with the Geneva Conference. And that is the end of your notes for today. So don't forget to write a summary, a couple sentences about what you learned.